this workshop today, we will begin, it's really 3 parts. We'll begin with presentations by a team of legal experts, folks who've been working in this for a long time. It's kind of an immigration 101 for you, followed by, we'll have a little break, and then we'll follow by people who've been through the process themselves. We have a 3-person panel. We're calling it the Been There, Done That panel. The first part will be recorded. That part will not be recorded for security and privacy concerns. And then finally a Q&A. And that will be through, as we're planning it now, through not orally, but through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions during you coming in with questions, or you have questions during the presentations, put them in the Q&A so we can see them and get to them later. That will be part 3, is a Q&A. I'm going to spotlight the next group of presenters so that you can all see them, and in a moment introduce them and then hand this over to them. This is the, pardon me as I search for people. Ian is hiding. There you are, Ian. Have you spotlit yourself? Excellent. I couldn't find you. Just real quickly, this august group of people, Reza Mazaheri is an attorney and legal services director of the Artistic Freedom Initiative, which provides pro bono legal services and other help to displaced artists. Are based in New York. Ian Kysel is also an attorney, and he's an assistant professor, clinical professor at Cornell Law School. He's an expert on international human rights law and immigration law, and he founded Cornell's Migrants' Rights Initiative. Catherine Skolnicki is the residency manager of City of Asylum Pittsburgh. She works directly with the writers who come through Pittsburgh and spend time there getting settled. And then finally, I wanted to introduce Mai Khoi, who's a musician and a pop star from Vietnam, who's now based in Pittsburgh. And Mai Khoi will be leading the second part, the panel, and will be with us for the Q&A. So with that, I am going to disappear myself and Mai Khoi and leave it to Ian, Reza, and Catherine. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted that we can have this dialogue. I'll be serving as sort of the moderator, so I'm going to jump in first and set the stage a little bit for this discussion or Q&A, which is really organized to try to demystify the notoriously complex U.S. immigration law system, which those of you joining the webinar no doubt know from personal experience much better than I, just how complicated and convoluted it can be to navigate this system. So we're hoping that this discussion will help demystify and educate and give some sense about how to proceed with your case, or how to help others with whom you're in contact. We'll focus today on some of the broad contours about how the system is organized, as well as some of the specific avenues that scholars and writers and artists have used to secure legal status, work authorization, pathways for ensuring family unity, ways to stay or get to stay in or get to the United States, and also provide some advice practically on how to secure support and the kinds of services or benefits that might be available within your community to help you pursue these various pathways. As a lawyer, I have to add the caveat at the outset today that we don't intend this panel to serve as legal advice on your case. We're really doing this as an educational program to provide an orientation and some basic information about the system. And I'm going to be asking questions of Reza Mazaheri and Catherine Skolnicki, who are experts here on these important issues. So I'm going to start with Reza, and as we work through some of the basics of this system, to help understand the contours of the law and these different pathways, we're going to try to organize the discussion today around a technical distinction in immigration law between what's known as immigrant visa or immigrant status and non-immigrant visas or non-immigrant status. That will help us sort of differentiate between certain kinds of visas that can lead to a permanent place or a permanent status and ultimately to citizenship within the United States, and other visas that are more temporary in nature and don't provide those kinds of benefits, but can of course provide really important avenues to status for those at risk. So as we work through these different types of status and processes, Reza will help us understand some of the basic requirements for each of these types of status and the process for pursuing them, so that we really begin to, understand important distinctions in who's eligible, what the scope of the benefits are for these different kinds of status, and what the process looks like, so that you can understand what might be relevant to you. And we do have the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you do have questions, you're welcome to put them in. We'll try to incorporate things that come up in the context of our Q&A, but because we're recording this session and trying to make this available to everyone, we'll wait to dialogue specifically about questions until the Q&A at the very end of the event. So now, Reza, we'll turn to your expertise. Can you help us understand some of the most relevant immigrant pathways that writers, scholars, and artists might pursue? We can maybe start with the sort of cornerstone of the U.S. immigration system, which is family immigration. Understand that pathway first, and there are lots of others that we'll talk about. And if you could just help us understand sort of, how does it work to petition or seek that status? What is the family immigration system, and how might it be relevant for those on the call today? Over to you.
Great, thank you, and thanks for everyone for being here. Can you all hear me well? Because I just want to make sure I'm not choppy with my internet. So the demystifying of U.S. immigration law is not a. Every time I think I have demystified it, then I'm mystified by something. I was just actually dealing with something where I was like, I figured it out. Tomorrow is court hearing, and then the government attorney sends me something, and I'm totally now lost. But anyway, let's go to what we need to talk about. There are, as Ian said, there are two types of visas: immigrant and non-immigrant. The difference between the two is the most basic thing is immigrant visas lead to a green card, which is basically permanent residency in the United States. And eventually, if someone chooses to become a U.S. citizen. So it's a pathway, as they say, pathway to U.S. citizenship. Non-immigrant visas are visas that allow someone to either enter the United States or remain in the United States for basically three reasons. One is to, go to Disney World, to visit family, weddings. Those are just basic tourist visitor visas. Or for some people who come here and they want to attend conferences, work-related seminars or training and things of that sort. The other one is non-immigrant work visas. These are visas that allow you to enter or remain in the United States to work legally, to make a living, and it could be as short as 1 day of work or many years. And the most common one is the visas that allow you to study in the United States. Those are student visas. There are different types of them. When we can either get into that today or another time. But let's just go back to the most common immigrant visa, which is, I have people come here and they're like, I really wanted to go back home. I miss my mom, but I just met my future partner and I want to stay in the United States, right? So the most common one is, they call it family unities, family-based immigrant visas, which are through marriage. And the family base also fall into multiple categories. The fastest way to get that green card is to have someone who is an immediate relative who's going to apply for you. What is an immediate relative? That's if you happen to be under 21, it's either one of your parents who is a U.S. citizen. If you're over 21 or even under 21, a spouse, or if you have, or if you're a parent of a U.S. citizen, that child becomes 21, that person can, apply. I'm sorry, 18, I believe, or 21, and they can apply for you. So it's immediate relative visas. And that can happen pretty quickly. If you happen to be in the United States, for example, and you're here on a student visa or any type of legal visa, there are restrictions. Like J visa has certain restrictions. And you marry someone, they can put in a bunch of applications, a family-based petition, a green card application, work permit application, and start the process in the United States. And in about, let's say, 9 months to a year and a half, you have your green card. And eventually you can apply for citizenship. If you happen to be outside the United States, and let's say you marry someone or you have one of those immediate relatives in the United States who applies for you, it's a two-part process. They file a petition in the United States with USCIS. Once that gets approved, that application is sent to a place called the National Visa Center. And then there's a whole bunch of really silly paperwork there. And once that's complete, they send it to an embassy that you chose, and there's more silly stuff that goes on in the embassy, and a bunch of it doesn't make sense. It hasn't been changed in decades. And then if you happen to be, let's say, from Sweden, things happen really fast at the embassy, right? And you get your visa, you come. If you happen to be a male from Iran, then there's this sort of slow process at the embassy. There's hopelessness, and there is calling me every day to see what's going on with the application. But eventually you end up coming here. Those are the family-based visas. So Ian, I'll stop there. And if you want to sort of me to continue, or I'll come back to it later, other types of immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas.
Great. Thanks so much, Reza. So just a couple follow-up questions about the family aspect. So first, just to confirm that if someone were to come here as a non-immigrant in a temporary status and have a U.S. citizen child, that child couldn't petition until they turn 21.
Yes. So the child has to become an adult, and for immigration purposes, and then you can't. So and if you say, oh, if I wish it was the way that you can have a child, but then a lot of people in Congress would flip out and call them anchor babies and things of that sort. But no, until that child is an adult, you can't apply for you. But there are sort of indirect ways to get green cards from that child. And that's if, let's say, you end up in a very stressful removal proceedings. So the government comes and tries to deport you. You're in immigration court. You happen to be here for, let's say, 10 years. You could show 10 years of physical presence. And if you have a U.S. citizen child, and you can prove something called extreme and unusual hardship to the child, now try to figure what that means, then maybe you can get a green card. But that's a totally different discussion. But the short answer to your question is no. A child cannot apply for a parent until the child becomes an adult.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. We will talk in a few minutes a little bit more about removal proceedings in immigration court and some of the ways that these things. Right now, we're just focusing on the kinds of petitions that people might pursue if they are not in removal or proceedings and not pursuing them in immigration court, although of course some of the things that Reza has described could also be available in court. But another follow-up question, just to confirm so that everybody understands the difference between the sort of consular processing for the situation that you described of someone who is married a U.S. citizen, but that person is abroad versus adjusting here. Can you just describe a little bit the difference between those two ways to seek status?
As it relates to the immigrant visa, family-based visa.
Yes, please.
So basically, let's take the easiest approach. You meet someone who is a U.S. citizen, you really fall in love, and the marriage is not just for a green card, and that person decides that you decide you want to live together in the United States. So the first thing that person would do is file what's called an I-130, which is a marriage-based, it's a family-based petition. In this particular scenario, it will be a spouse of the United States. what they do, you fill out a bunch of forms, and then you have to provide evidence that this marriage is real. So you show, proof of the courtship before you get to that point. How did you meet? Photos, letters from friends. If you're living together, proof of cohabitation. You send all this stuff to USCIS, and it takes anywhere from, like, let's say 6 to 9 months, maybe even more, for USCIS to process that. Right now, it's a little bit longer. Once they approve it, they'll send you an approval. They say congratulations, and then 30 days after that, they'll send your entire file to the National Visa Center, where National Visa Center's job is to basically process or put together the initial paperwork that goes to the embassy. At that point, they collect background information, security related stuff, immigration history, if there's been any criminal history, all the documents, like basically birth certificates, information about your travels, all that stuff that the State Department needs to process the visa. So that takes a few months for them to do that, and eventually then you go and wait online for your visa interview, and that really depends on your national origin and what embassy has jurisdiction over your case. Like I said, when we do cases for Europeans, things happen really fast, right? But for people from what they call the Middle East or North Africa, things are much slower. But so the process, it's basically USCIS first, National Visa Center, and then the embassy. And when you go to the embassy, you go to your interview. If everything goes well, they'll give you an immigrant visa in your passport. You enter the United States with that visa, and about 30 days later, you get your green card in the mail. So, and then if you're, again, if you get that green card through marriage, then 3 years later, you can apply to become a U.S. citizen.
Great, thanks so much. So what we're hearing is that, for the family-based petitions, there's an avenue to adjust status in the United States without needing to go through that consular processing. And the real difference is sort of, where are you located when you start the process?
Okay, just one point I think is relevant, because a lot of people have this question, especially people who are here on some type of a non-immigrant visa, and then they marry someone, and that person wants to apply for a green card for them in the United States, adjustment of status. One of the questions they have immediately is, can I leave the United States? I want to file my green card application, but next month, like, my cousin's wedding in India or wherever, right? Unfortunately, you can't step out of the United States. You'll abandon your green card application, but there is something called an advance parole. Basically, at the time that you file for adjustment of status or green card, you can also ask the United States government for permission to leave. That takes about 4 to 5 months to get that. So there is about this 4 to 5 months that you're stuck here and you can't leave the United States. So anybody who's planning to do something like that, they should, especially people who have, let's say, travel, a lot of people who do performances, musical performances. Hey, you know what, I have a show in such and such country. Oops, I just filed my green card application. Now I can't leave the United States. There's something to take into consideration when you file that. So you have to sort of make some plans ahead of time. Yeah.
That's really helpful, Reza. These practical details are, can often be so disruptive in people's lives, but aren't necessarily straightforward to figure out from knowing the basics. So the other thing, just to underscore, that Reza mentioned earlier, is that when you apply, you can also apply while the green card application is pending for a work authorization document. So you, as an applicant, can have a work authorized status. So although you might be a non-immigrant and you might have a work authorized non-immigrant status, while your adjustment of status application is pending, that's also a process to be able to work. And then, of course, once the green card is granted, that is a permanent status that comes with work authorization. I guess on the last question on family might be if there are any special considerations for derivatives. If let's say someone comes and has children and is then married to a U.S. citizen, at any considerations, or maybe they have relatives who are at risk in their country, anything you might share about those family members that are relevant to the immigration category?
Yeah, by derivative, EM means basically, if anybody who's attached to you, your immediate family, can they also get a green card? So let's say, you come to the United States, you have a child from another relationship, and now you meet someone in the United States, that person's a US citizen and can apply for a green card for you. The question is, okay, can my child also get a green card? There is no, strangely, even though at the time of marriage, that child legally in the United States becomes a child of both parents, there is no derivative relationship from the US citizen to that child. But that US citizen, that US citizen parent can file a separate petition for that child. So at the same time, what usually happens is, okay, you know what, I met this person with a child, I'm applying for him or her, I also want to petition for the child. So you can do that. In certain instances, let's say if let's say you're outside of the country, you have children, you have an entire family, you have a spouse, you have children, and one of your siblings happens to be a US citizen, and that sibling put a petition in many years ago, and now it's approved, there is derivative relationships. So, you get a green card through your brother or sister and your, spouse, and your children also get a green card. But when it comes to a spouse of a US citizen, that spouse has to apply separately from each family member.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Reza. So lots of details here in the family category. This is the vast majority of US immigrant visas are acquired through family relationships, but there are lots of other forms of status that we're going to be talking about. And I think it maybe makes sense to turn to labor petitions, the immigrant visas that might be available in the world of work. So tell us a little bit about the process of being sponsored through work.
Okay, I'm going to generally, because there's a lot of sort of layers to it, so I don't want to take up too much time, but EB-based, so immigrant visa, employment-based immigrant visas, and they fall into different categories. The most common ones are EB1 and EB2 for people, for our audience today. EB1 and EB2, you usually need for both of those an employer, right? Someone who needs your skills or your work experience, comes to you and says, hey, I want to hire you, and I'm going to, people use the word sponsor, let's just use the word sponsor you for a green card. So that's a very complicated process. It can take a lot of time. There's something called perm processing, which is you have to go through the Department of Labor. So just to give you a short version of it, employer comes to you, wants to hire you, wants to give you a green card. The first process is to create a job description. This is your job description. You send that to the Department of Labor. And then there's something called the prevailing wage. The Department of Labor says, hey, you know what, you can hire this person and apply for a green card for them, but you can't pay them below a certain amount. That's there to protect American workers, right? Once you go through that process and Department of Labor gives a green light, your perm is approved, then you have to file, the employer has to file a immigrant employment-based petition. It's a form I-140. Then once that gets approved, if you're in the United States, you can adjust status and become a green card. If you're outside, sort of similar to the family-based thing, your I-140 is approved, it goes to the National Visa Center, you eventually go to the embassy and get your immigrant visa and enter the United States. But there's a lot of other sort of nuances to it. I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to get into what's important, I think, for our audience today. There are two exceptions in the EB1 and EB2 category where you do not need an employer, right? Under EB1, there's something called extraordinary ability visa. This is something that I believe Mike Hoy, for her achievements was recognized. So basically, you want to come to the United States, whether you're outside or inside the US with some kind of visa, and you say, look at me, I'm so famous, I'm so great, look at the newspapers have covered my work, my face is everywhere, I won an international prize like an Oscar or a Pulitzer Prize, and you should give me a green card because you should assume that I'm going to do well in the country. I don't need an employee, right? And the nicknames for that visa, some people call it Einstein visa, but it's really the brain drain visa. This is how the United States takes all the talent from other countries, right? In that case, you just apply for yourself. You file an I-140, you provide all the evidence about your achievements, how great you are, and if it gets approved, you can get a green card that way. Under the EB-2, there's something called a national interest waiver. In that case, it's similar to the extraordinary ability. They have different criteria that you have to show. But let's say for someone who has an MFA, you have a master's in fine arts, or you have a certain amount of work experience, and the type of work you do is something that the United States is interested in. Let's say that you have invented the biggest missile in the world, right? Of course, the US like, oh, we love you. Come here, we give you a green card, right? But not everything works that way, right? But we've done a lot of the case for artists. We've always been, for certain categories in the arts, we've been able to make the argument that, and we refer to like famous speeches by JFK, or even the fact that the United States government has created agencies and funds, and there are foundations that give money to the arts. So if you could show a level of achievement and recognize achievement in your own field, and then the job of the lawyer at that point is to prove that the type of work that you do is in the national interest of the United States, then you can skip again that Labor Department process, right? You don't need an employer, you don't need to go to the Department of Labor. You just have to prove. So to give you examples, we've done national interest waiver cases for everything from composers to poets, to authors, to visual artists, and people on the business side, right? People in AI and tech, and even lawyers, right? So there is, I think, we particularly like the national interest waiver visa, because there is a lot of room as a lawyer for us to be creative and to make interesting arguments on how someone's work and experience is in the national interest of the U.S.
That's really, really helpful, Reza. So
two categories that I think are, and we can get into it later on or after this seminar.
Yeah, just a couple of follow-up questions there. So one, just to confirm this big distinction between the recognizing that there's a lot of complexity here, but when we think about labor, or at least when people talk about kind of sponsorship and employment, there's a lot of labor petitions for immigrant visas. So those are visas that bring, again, a green card and a path to citizenship. A lot of the discussion is around needing an employer to serve in that sponsor role. And that's complicated. It can take a long time. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions on that. So first, talk about the employment authorization, situation. What does it mean if someone finds an employer and the employer says, well, I'm interested in sponsoring you? Practically, what does that mean for someone's ability to stay if they're, let's say, in a non-immigrant status when they start the process?
Sure. So a lot of times people are in here and they find someone who wants to sponsor them for a green card. It just happens to be also the company that sponsors them for the actual non-immigrant visa that they're on to begin with. So the most common path to that is people who are here on H-1Bs, right? H-1B is a non-immigrant work visa, which has kind of a similar, but a sort of a mini version of that labor sort of certification process. So what happens is basically, a lot of employers want to test you out. They may sponsor you for an H-1B, or you may happen to be on an O visa, and you're already working for them, or you're working for somebody else, and somebody else wants to take you away from them, right? So you're already in a position where you're working legally, right? While you're working legally on that underlying non-immigrant visa, your employer starts that whole sort of, whether it's EB-1, EB-2, or even EB-3 process, right? And there may be gaps. You may lose your underlying non-immigrant visa at some point and have to stop working and wait until you get a temporary work permit through the green card application that your employer has filed. So those are, I think, people who are already here on it and they're working legally. But also there are people who are here who are students. You're a student, you did really well, you get your master's, PhD, whatever somebody wants to employ you. A lot of students at the end of their when their student studies end, they go in a period of what's called the OPT, right? Maybe the OPT basically allows students to work for a certain amount of time. People who are into science and technology actually can work longer on OPT. Basically, you finish your studies, you're able to work here legally, you're still in that student status, but you're working, you have a work permit. And that's usually when the employer comes in and they use that time that you're here legally and you're able to work as a bridge to get to that point where you get your green card. So they put all the paperwork during that time. If things get approved on a timely, if everything's done in a timely manner, there are little nuances that are maybe confusing, like visa availability and things of that sort, which we don't have to get into now. But let's just assume that everything goes smoothly during that time. By the time your work permit, your authorization to work ends from the underlying non-immigrant visa, you can begin working for your employer, hopefully. Not everything works in that smoothly. There is the different categories of employment-based visas. There are, there's something called visa availability. If the visa is available, can you even file your green card application at the time or not? But that's a whole seminar by itself. It's a whole CLE class, I think.
So that's really helpful, and I think the main takeaway here is that there are these pathways for an employer sponsorship of work visas, but it takes a lot of planning and takes a lot of lead time, and so it's just something to know about and think about because it's something that can be pursued by both a current employer as well as a potential future employer, and pursuing that doesn't mean that you would have to leave a current employer if you found someone who was willing to pursue that process with you.
Absolutely. And something also to keep in mind is the cost of these things, right? The cost, the employer. So if somebody comes to me and say, hey, my employer wants to get a green card for me, basically, it's not, the employee is not my client. It's the employer has to hire me. For most, there are O visas, P visas, other kind of work visas, non-immigrant visas that the beneficiary or the person who's trying to get that status can hire an attorney. But it's for most of the process, for majority of the process, the employment-based visa process, the employer is the one who has to pay for it and invest, in the whole perm process and the petition.
That's really, really helpful. And just to preview that these are some of the issues that we'll be talking with Catherine about in the next phase of this panel. Thanks everyone for bearing with us, and thanks Catherine for bearing with us. We're trying to really lay the landscape with Reza first, and then talk about some of these practical issues as we move forward. And before we move away from the labor pathway to an immigrant visa, I just want to circle back to both the extraordinary ability EB1 as well as the EB2 national interest waiver processes, because the key takeaway there is that unlike the employment sponsorship that we were just talking about, where you would be working with an employer who would sponsor it, one of the benefits of some of these other categories is that people can self-petition. So talk a little bit about how that works, you've talked a little bit about how that works, but just emphasize for us, sort of how people might think about it if they were interested in exploring that for themselves. What kind of questions might they ask? And then I have a couple of other follow-ups, but let's just start with that. I think, especially because you called it the Einstein visa, people might be wondering, is this really something that's available to me? So maybe you can give some examples, some further examples about how scholars or artists or writers might pursue that.
Yeah, we mostly do, most of our extraordinary ability visa petitions are for artists. And by artists, I mean, everything from, visual artists, filmmakers, writers, composers. It's one of those things that is pretty strange. You could be a great artist and not get this visa, or you could be an okay artist and qualify, because the way they look at it is this very mechanical way. They have 10 criteria, and if you can just, fit your sort of, if your resume happens to sort of fit, if you can satisfy 3 out of those 10 criteria, you can get the petition approved. There is when you file those things, there's a two-part. First, you have to show the quantity of the evidence satisfies 3 out of the 10. Then you have to prove that the quality of the evidence. So, for example, one of them is that your work has been exhibited, showcased, right? That's basically a lot of visual art painters, photographers, or sculptors who've had their works shown at galleries or museums, a place like that. So that's usually an easy one for us to show, hey, look, this person has had solo and group shows in 20 different places. But later on, we have to prove that the quality of those shows reach a certain level. So if, let's say, you've shown it in your work in, big galleries in New York, Paris, London, places like that, obviously that has more value than, let's say, you've shown your work in, places like, community centers in Oklahoma City or wherever, right? Not that, that's the way they look at it. Other things they look at, if there's been articles written about the petitioner here in newspapers and major, what they call major media. We don't have to get into what major media is, but major media or trade publications. And again, they look, you may be able to satisfy that easily by showing, hey, you know what, these 20 different newspapers wrote about me. And then later on, you have to prove that, okay, was it New York Times or was it, Jersey Journal, right? And there's something called significant recognition. If let's say your peers in the industry recognize, this is why people come to us and say, oh, you know what, I've heard that I need recommendation letters. They're not really recommendation letters. Well, they're supposed to be expert testimonials, right? People in the field who hopefully objectively know of your work, and they recognize that you have given something significant to the field, right? A lot of people come to us with people, close, my professors, can my professor write? Professors always write recommendation letters. They rarely say no. But USCIS doesn't really like that. They know that you go to your professor, they'll write something for you, right? So we like to get letters from people who have a bit of a distance, right? That they've known you from afar, and they recognize your sort of distinction in the field from a distance. There are other categories. If you've had a critical or a critical role in an organization that has a distinguished reputation, if you've made a lot of money, and so on and on. So there are these criteria. So you may be able to, if you could satisfy 3 out of 10, and then later on, that analysis that they have about the quality of it, which they call the Kyselian analysis, if you can show that all of this stuff, not only I meet the certain criteria, but also the quality of the evidence is very strong, you can get that approved. That's the extraordinary ability. On the national interest waiver, it's a bit different. It's if you can show that, let's say you have an advanced degree, you have a certain amount of work experience. Let's say if you've written scholarly articles or published stuff, and that's like the first phase of it is the first sort of phase of it is not that hard to prove. There's a lot of people who come to us, they've already reached, say, they have PhDs or masters, and they've written peer-reviewed articles, and have certain level of distinction in their field. The challenge there is to prove that, okay, what they did in their home country or what they've done to this point, that they are going to have the ability to continue to do that in the United States, right? So let's say if you are an actor, and this is where the challenge comes, right? You could be the greatest actor in your home country, but then you come here, are you going to be able to, there are language barriers for women, right? For women, it's a challenge because even in the United States, women have a disadvantage when it comes to, Hollywood, right? When it comes to, let's say, age and all that stuff. So there is definitely the discrimination that is in the field, right? So they kind of realize that you're coming from another country, you don't speak the language, you're not, even though you're famous, we don't think that you're going to be able to continue to do what you're doing here. And then on top of that, we have to show that, okay, you know what, this type of work is something that's going to add to the national interest of the United States. This is why I initially used that sort of, people who have expertise in military stuff, right? That's obvious. It's an easy way to tell, to show how the concept works, right? And it's also very time specific. There are trends, right? So during the 2 years of COVID, we had a lot of people who worked in sciences, particularly in the pharmaceutical, right? With focus on, let's say, vaccine development, right? So that's kind of easy for us at that point to prove that. But that sort of goes up and down. There was a time that if, let's say, you just did coding, you were a computer programmer, there was a national interest for you. But now with AI, ChatGPT doing a lot of that work, are we going to be able to show the same thing? This is where I like the arts, because those sort of trends in other fields, there was a time remember, everybody wanted to become a financial analyst, right? Everybody was on like Wall Street, brokers. Before computers, you actually had people who were brokers, and people used to get green cards at that time by showing that it's in the national interest. What I like about the arts is always sort of the same. There's no sort of up and down trend, and there's plenty of, I think, ammunition for us to show that, look, writers, and not only that, because look, we've been able to show, we actually provide proof we've shown what the Department of Defense, how much it invests in the arts. There are popular TV shows that are partly funded by the Department of Defense. So, wherever we can dig up information to show that it's in the national interest of the United States. So we really like the national interest waiver for artists. It's sometimes easier for us to get that than the extraordinary ability, because extraordinary ability visa tends to be very rigid. You either fit into that category or you don't. You either have that publication or you don't, or you've made a certain amount of money or not. But with national interest waiver, we can show that, hey, you know what? The type of work you do, there's an interest both in the arts and culture sector, but also in national security aspects for those.
That's really helpful, Reza. And we've spent a good amount of time on these types of visa because they are the most durable form of status, the way to get the pathway to citizenship. And I think also these last two are things that people are less familiar with, and so it's important for you as writers and artists and scholars to know about these mechanisms so that you can explore them yourself. I think this is a good. So I have two quick follow-ups on the sort of these last parts, and then we're going to transition into humanitarian form of immigrant visa, asylum. But before we do, Reza, I wonder if you can just quickly note implications for immediate relatives of these self-petitions, and also how employment authorization might work, to the extent that someone might fall out of a status.
Okay, so there is derivative, I should say, there is derivative status. So if you happen to be your spouse and your children, not your parents, in this case, it would be only spouse and children. Children under 21 and your spouse will also be eligible for a green card. If your petition is approved, you put the names of your family members on the petition, and if the visa is available, you apply for a green card, you'll get a green card at the same time, right? For work permits, everyone who can put a green card application, which means the self-petitioner and the spouse and the children, you can all, at the time that you file your green card application, also file for temporary work permits. So while you're waiting for that green card, about 3-4 months after you file, you'll get work permits, and that work permit will allow you to work in any field, doing anything, and also gives the person a certain level of normalcy. You can get a social security number, you can drive, you can use that work permit to get on a plane if they require what they call a real ID. And eventually you get your green card. So yes, so the short answer is your immediate family members, but not your parents, just your spouse and children do get derivative status and work permit.
Excellent. Thanks, Reza. So this is a good, because we're going to transition to asylum, I think this is a good time to just note for everyone, Reza mentioned earlier the issue of expense and was sort of referring most explicitly to legal fees. But all of these, or most of these petitions, including advanced parole and the employment authorization, have separate application fees. Those are all available on the USCIS website. So you can look and see how much it would cost to file these different forms of petitions. We won't spend time talking about that here. That is something that you can take a look at. But now we'll transfer to a slightly different context, which is to talk a little bit about asylum. We have lots of topics. I think another sort of 10 or so minutes before we'll shift to the next and very important phase, which is talking about sort of the practical aspects of dialoguing with Catherine. But let's, asylum itself could be a whole 90-minute webinar, and so we won't be able to get into a lot of the details. But of course, many of those of us, or those of you who are joining us today, or either might yourself or a family member be eligible to pursue asylum, or you might be working with or advising those who are here and face enough risk to seek that status. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how, in broad strokes, Reza, what is asylum? How does it work? And I think then we'll talk a little bit about immigration court as a sort of separate topic, but very briefly, and then we'll switch to talking about non-immigrant visas briefly, because you've covered some of those already. But yeah, how does asylum feature into this discussion?
Okay. Look, a lot of just give you an example, we represent a lot of artists who apply for asylum, and for whatever reason, let's say that you don't really qualify for an EB-2 national interest waiver or extraordinary ability, or you may qualify for it, but there are timing issues. By the time you figured out you qualify for it, you're out of status. You don't have, you came here on a tourist visa, a visitor visa, and you stayed for more than 6 months. Now you don't have status. Even if you're, let's say, EB-1 and EB-2 were to get approved, you can't adjust status. There are technical issues. Or you came here as a student, then you realize, oh my God, I can't afford this. And now again, you fall out of status. First of all, remember, you have 1 year from the time when you enter the United States to apply for asylum. There are exceptions, right? There are exceptions. One of them called as changed circumstances. Let's say you've been here for 5 years, studying, doing whatever you want. And now, you can't go back home, and it's been over 1 year. One of the most simplest ways to think about changed circumstances: I was here, everything was fine at home, there was a revolution, the new government wants to, arrest me or kill me, or maybe not even that, or the new government would not allow me to live the way I ought to live, right? Let's say you're a member of the LGBTQ community, right? The new government, has outlawed that, right? Or not even, or let's say you change your religion, and the new government is the kind of government that doesn't sort of tolerate that, right? So that could be changed circumstances, or the circumstances in your own life. Oh my God, I went online and I posted something about the president and I got death threats, right? That's a changed circumstance too. Now, asylum only applies to people who are here. And there's two types. There's something called affirmative asylum. This is something you're here for whatever reason, and you decide that you can't go back home, and you tell the US government basically that I cannot go back because I have fear of going back because of my race, my religion, my nationality, my political opinion, or my what they call a membership in a particular social group, right? And that membership in a particular social group can be a very broad sort of concept. That's affirmative. There's something called, and Ian mentioned it briefly, defensive, and I hope none of you end up in that situation where you have to do defensive asylum. Defensive asylum is when for the US government has you in their custody, basically, physically or legally, and they want to throw you out of the United States. They want to remove you from the United States. And now you file an asylum application as a defense. You say, hey, you know what? If you send me back to my home country, this horrible thing will happen to you. And then you're in this court system. If you're fortunate, you're outside and you go through this process of going back and forth to court. If you're unfortunate, you're detained in a very sort of a not pleasant place, and you have to fight your basically fight your removal through asylum. The only advantage of being detained is sometimes if I was in that situation, I may rather be detained because the process is much faster. So you can really sort of find your fate in 6, 7, 8 months versus 6, 7, 8 years of being outside and running back and forth to court. Something to keep in mind, time. It is a ridiculously backlogged system. It's a broken system. It's just a mess. When you file for asylum, expect you're not going to get an interview for another 5, 6, 7 years. You may get lucky, or your file may just pop up somewhere and you get it in 3 months, a year, but I haven't seen that in a long time. I still have cases that we filed in 2015 or 16, and we still don't have interviews. The good news is that once you file your asylum application, there's something called the EAD clock, which is the employment authorization clock. 150 days after you file your asylum application, you can file for a work permit. And they're supposed to give you your first work permit within 30 days of filing. If you're lucky, you get that. It's valid for 2 years, and you could keep renewing it until you have an interview. Eventually, one day, you know, if you still decide you want to be here, you have your interview. And if everything goes well in that interview, they tell you to come back to the asylum office in 2 weeks to get your results. It reminds me of, like, you know, back in school, we come get your results. You go back in there, you get your results, everything goes well, you become an asylee. As an asylee, you have pretty much every right as someone who's a permanent resident of the United States, right? You can work, you have a pretty much normal life. You know, you can't vote and because you're not a citizen. 1 year after you become an asylee, you can apply for a green card, basically. And that process used to be fast, but that's slow process too. And then 4 years from the time that you get your green card, you could become a U.S. citizen. One thing to keep in mind is, you know, once you apply for asylum, this is very important. People forget this. Unless you have some other kind of status that allows you to travel outside the United States, you are stuck here. So, you know, it's a big country, you know, there's places to see, travel around, but it can become a little bit claustrophobic. And one of the most, I think, painful things is, you know, if you're waiting 6, 7, 8 years, you miss a lot of things about, you know, you don't see family members, weddings, births, deaths. Those are the things that you have to, but sometimes you have no other choice but to go this route. I always tell people, when they come to me, I usually ask people, hey, let me see your resume. Let me see your CV. Let's talk about what you do, you know, before you jump into this thing. Let's make it last resort, right? As a last resort option, it's a good option, but it is it can be a tiresome, long process.
Thanks so much, Reza. And just as I've been asking with these other statuses, just tell us what happens to immediate relatives through assuming you get asylum.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, if you just happen to be here, and let's say all of you came in on a tourist visa, student visa, whatever it is, or merely if you just cross the border, right? And then you apply for affirmative asylum. There is the sort of the principal applicant, and then there's everybody else. So if you get asylum, everybody gets asylum, all right? Now, and David's going to be able to talk to us about this. David's case was, you know, there are times that people are here and they can't go back. You know, you just came here for something, and oh my God, just things, you know, went crazy back home, and now you apply for affirmative asylum. You apply for affirmative asylum. When you do get asylum at that point, and your family members, immediate family members, again, in this case, it would be just spouse and children, are overseas, there is a process to bring them here on refugee visas, right? There's something called I-730. So once you have your asylum, you file Form I-730 with the USCIS. And then when that gets approved, there's this whole process at the embassy where they go in for a short interview and they get these, basically refugee visas, and they enter the United States as refugees. So the distinction between refugee and asylum: asylee is someone who's in the United States and applies for that protected status. Refugees are people who are outside and trying to come in to be protected. So in this case, they're not really, it's this sort of a middle place with your family. They're not refugees in the sense that they have to go through a process of going to refugee camps and UNHCR and things of that sort. But the type of visa is technically refugee visas. So when they enter, they become, sort of under refugee visas, they have all the rights and privileges of an asylee, and then they too can apply for green cards in that 1 year, at 1 year point.
Great.
Work permits. Here's the thing: I usually suggest that people, even after you get asylum, to get that work permit to apply, because it's an actual ID. You go to a lot of employers with the paperwork. It's like, yo, I'm an asylee, and they look all confused, like, what is this? I don't understand. But when you show them this thing that looks official and it's shiny, and even for traveling within the United States, it helps, because at some point you're gonna have to stop using that passport from your home country. So you're gonna need another thing. If you want to travel after you become an asylee, you get asylum status, you can apply for a travel document, refugee travel document. It's a weird looking version of the US passport, but it allows you to go outside the country and come back in. You can't technically use the passport from the country that you sought protection away from. Yeah.
Great. I think I can imagine it's an alphabet soup of all this new information, lots of different forms and acronyms and labels, but we really have covered lots of really important pathways to a permanent status in the U.S. That are relevant to writers, scholars, and artists at risk. We've talked in passing about several non-immigrant statuses. In some ways, this presentation has been sort of inverted in the sense that we've begun talking about immigrant status, and many people who are pursuing an adjustment of status to these more permanent statuses are here in a temporary non-immigrant status. But I just wondered if we could, for just maybe a couple of minutes, Reza, go over some key considerations for people who are, I think here we're going to focus on people who are already here, and not think about, pursuing these non-immigrant statuses from abroad. But if people are already here and are thinking about trying to stay and pursue either an extension of an existing non-immigrant status, or a sort of transition or change to a different non-immigrant status, let's think about, what are those? Do people have to consular process? Can they become an immigrant later? Can they have or keep their spouse or kids here, or bring them? Lots of different specific questions. But I think that the statuses that have come up so far are, you mentioned F status and the optional professional training. That's probably relevant to some, but maybe fewer of our attendees today. J status, you talked about that, and maybe you could talk also about transferring from one institution to another if people are in J status, as well as the possibility of having a waiver of the return requirement. We've heard about H-1Bs quite a bit, and then you also mentioned O-1 self-petition. So maybe just jump in there and give us the survey.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to J visas, to be honest with you, I'm my partner is much of a better expert in that, but I do have. The issue with the J visas, some J visa holders have something called a 2-year residency, home residency requirement. That means if you want to, let's say, go from a J and you want to get a green card in the United States, they require you to go back and live home for 2 years and then apply for a green card, unless you apply for a waiver. And that's a totally different topic. Or even if you want to change status from J to something else, you still have the same issues. The most common visa that we we work with, because again, we work mainly with artists, is the O1B. O1B is basically, it's the artist, something called an extraordinary ability, just like the AB1. But the standard is not extraordinary ability, is they call it this basically distinction in the field, right? Because there's always been this sort of a weird thing. How can I show that I'm sort of famous? I just got out of college, But so we deal a lot of this MFA students. You're an MFA, now you're reaching the point of you're on OPT and you want to stay in the United States, but you don't really qualify for AB1. The O1B is always a good option. And unfortunately, you do have to involve as a person or an entity who you're going to work for, right? So the O1B, the first part of it, you have to show, okay, you know what, let's use the simplest version. The simplest version, you know what, I came out of MFA students and I do animation. I do animation, and let's say this, company, Disney, wants to hire me, and they're willing to basically provide a contract for 3 years. It could be anywhere from a day to 3 years, right? Or O1B. You can also extend it when it reaches the end. So let's just say it's a 3-year commitment. They have to provide some kind of a contract. Here it is. Here's a contract, the itinerary. Here's where you're going to work, how much you're going to get paid, and it's all the details of it, right? And now the second part is, again, sort of similar to the extraordinary ability. And this, but for O1B, it's 6 criteria, and you have to satisfy 3 of them. The good thing is there's no Kyselian analysis. The quality thing doesn't exist. As long as you meet the criteria 3 out of 6, you get approved. Again, some of the publications, it's again, one of them. It's a critical role in an event that had past critical role in an event that has distinguished reputation. So if, let's say you're a theater actor, you happen to be, in a play that was sort of a, big name, that's the distinguished reputation of the event, and you were the, main or, one of the lead actors, or you were an actor, you were the director, or you were the, even we've done work for lighting designers, set designers, costume designers. You have to sometimes make an argument and really make them understand what a lead role or a critical role is. And then they have lead role or critical in organizations. So that was for events. So this is organizations, distinguished reputation. So there's this remuneration. If you could show that you get a one-time payment, or the contracts that you received, the amount of pay that you're getting is way ahead of everybody else, or your peers, you can satisfy that too. We like that remuneration thing, actually, because they compare it to other people in your field, right? Unfortunately, a lot of artists don't make that much money. So when we do find someone who has, let's say, a contract that happens to be, show some kind of a significant pay, it's usually easy for us to show that it's higher than others in the field. So the O visa, now, this was the obvious thing. The employer, it's just a one employer 9-to-5 job, but a lot of artists don't work that way. They are freelance workers. Let's say that you are here and you're an actor and you want to be here for 3 years and you want to work on, 20 different projects. Right? Each one of those is an employer, right? They don't expect each one to file a separate petition. You can get an agent that comes between you and all those employers, and that agent becomes what they call agent on behalf of multiple employers. And that agent becomes the petitioner. Now, the contracts they're flexible. So you don't have to get paid, let's say, on an hourly, weekly, or monthly basis, or have an annual salary. You can have arrangements, for example, in revenue sharing. You could do work, you get paid later. So let's say we've done work for painters that we've had a gallery become the petitioner, and the gallery has entered into a commission type of a situation, right? Or you paint me 10 paintings, we're going to put it up for show, and then whatever we sell, we get 50-50, right? They don't really question that arrangement, but they want an itinerary. They want to know, okay, what are you going to be doing? Where are you going to be doing this work? The good thing about the O visa is also allows artists to work and build that resume and build that CV eventually for an EB1, right? And you can extend that. Technically, you can extend it indefinitely, but at some point they come back to you. They want to show, okay, you know what, you've been extending it, but show that your distinction in the field has remained at the same level or is even higher, right? So the O1B. Then there's P visa. P is for like for performance. If you are a musician and you're here, and I think maybe Michael, we had actually at some point, she was on a P visa. You want to either enter the United States to have a concert, different cities. You could be on that P visa. The P visa, you either have to show that you're famous to some level, you're part of a big band or a solo performer who is well known, or that your work is what they call, it's a P3 visa if your work is culturally unique. So if you come into the United States to, let's say, do some kind of a musical event that is, particular to your own culture, and the venues where you're going to play are places that usually are known for culturally unique performances, you can get that too. You can do a change of status in the United States, or you can, again, file a petition here and get the visa through. One of the challenges is a very practical thing people should know. I'm here on OPT and I have a great O visa case. We file it and you get it. Now your status has changed from F to O1B, right? Now you have to remember, if you leave the United States, even though you're allowed to remain and work in the United States for the next 3 years, but during that time, if you leave the United States, you're going to have to file a visa application at the embassy and get that visa in your passport to be able to come back into the United States, right? So even though you change your status, you still have to go through that practical step. So make your plans, because you look at the schedule of some of these embassies and they don't have an appointment available for months. You may go outside to see your family or to do some work and not be able to come back for many months. So that's sort of a quick overview of that.
Thanks, Reza. That's,
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and maybe if you could just add a couple of words about the H-1B and issues around the cap that people might hear about, and then what kind of entities are exempt from that.
Yeah. Most people come here H-1Bs. You have people who work in the tech sector, or financial sector. It's what they call a dual intent non-immigrant visa. What does that mean? This is something else to consider. Some non-immigrant visas are they call they only have non-immigrant intent, which means when you apply for them, you're telling the United States government that, hey, you know what, when I'm done, I'm going back home, right? So that's the J visa, the student visa, the tourist visa, and stuff like that. The H-1B allows you to come to the United States either intending to remain here for a specific amount of time and to work here for a company, or eventually change your status to something else. The reason that the H-1B is very popular with Indian applicants is because the visa availability for immigrant visas is a long wait for Indian citizens and Chinese citizens. So H-1B would allow someone from India, for example, to work here, keep extending it for many years until that visa becomes available and they can get an employment-based visa. Now, there is a cap, which means, let's say you have an employer wants to hire you and get you an H-1B. There's only a certain number of visas available every year. So there's like a lottery system. So I believe on April 1st of every year, they open the doors, they said, put in your applications, and then there's massive flood of applications. And on a lottery system, they pick so many applications until they reach that cap, and it's over. The only exception is for nonprofits, right? So if you're a nonprofit institution, so say if you want to work for a human rights organization, for certain arts organizations, let's say, our organization, Artistic Freedom Initiative, is a nonprofit 501c. There is no cap, right? You can, if someone was willing to sponsor you. Now, what does sponsorship mean? Very similar to what I was talking about before on the employment-based visa. You have to get a labor certification. Again, you have to go to the Department of Labor, give them a job description. It's easier, much easier and faster process. Then you can't pay people below a certain amount. If you meet if you meet those criteria, you pay them what they're supposed to get paid, and then then basically your H-1B. There's a lot of different types of paperwork that you have to do. I personally hate it, but it's a lot of people are here on H-1B. It's a good way, again, to buy time. Especially a lot of employers prefer to it's less money for them to invest in, and then if they really don't like you, or if the circumstances change of the company, it's easier for them to let go. They haven't invested much time or money into it. A lot of employers like to go through the H-1B process to test out the relationship before they get into that longer, more expensive relationship of filing an employment-based petition.
Great.
It's difficult. I think for artists, it's usually we go different routes, but you could certainly do H-1B as well.
Thanks, Reza. I think now we've gone through really all the key, most important immigrant and non-immigrant pathways, and are getting to now in many ways what's the most significantly practical and important information, Catherine, which is how practically do people pursue this? First, Reza's a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. We've both been dialoguing about the law in this process. And even with some of these, we've been talking about the possibility of self-petitioning. But, how do people pursue this? And if they want to enlist the help of a lawyer, how do they go about thinking about that in the United States?
Sure. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay. I'm glad to be with you all today. If you're here with us, or if you're listening to the recording later, I'll just share just a touch about my background, where I'm coming from. I manage the residency program at City of Asylum in Pittsburgh. So I work with artists who are coming here mostly on J1 type visas, but sometimes not, sometimes other visas, and support them while they're in residence in Pittsburgh. As well as in my former position, I used to work in case management in a refugee resettlement agency. And so often I would be kind of the liaison between an immigration lawyer and a client. And so I guess I'm not a lawyer, but I've supported many people in their process of immigration. So first and foremost, for the population that we're kind of aiming the seminar for, I think it's important for you to first go to your immediate network. So the sponsoring university or organization that brought you here most likely has some sort of contact for immigration support. So if it's a university, they likely have a law clinic, or if it's an organization, they likely will be able to connect you with some type of attorney or group. Now, there's a lot of things to mention about law clinics at universities. They often have a very long wait list, if they have space at all. And so it's really important that you then seek to find the networks that those law clinics are connected to. So usually a law clinic will have a list of attorneys that are willing to provide either pro bono or low bono work. And what is the difference? Pro bono is for free, and low bono is more based on your income. So if you can prove that you qualify for, like low income service, then you would receive those immigration services at a much lower rate. Yes. One thing to mention in your search, I've seen many scenarios where someone is just doing a Google search for immigration help, and they come across someone who claims to be a lawyer, and in fact, they are not a lawyer. So please do not pursue any path without getting either someone to vouch that this is an actual attorney or another organization who can do so. So please always ask for help from people that you trust in your pursuit of legal support. You can also receive support from an accredited representative, which is someone who is authorized by the US government to pursue certain legal processes. And usually they work for what's called a recognized organization. So this is like a nonprofit. Oftentimes within wherever you're living, there are specific immigrant social service centers or organizations that have immigration departments, and sometimes they are not, they don't have actual attorneys working there, but they have people who've gone through enough training and have enough experience to be able to process certain applications for you. And so just again, make sure you do your homework and diligently ensure that who you're working with is in fact a lawyer and is licensed in the state where you live. I know that many people are asking questions about costs and everything. That's a huge question that's very much dependent on, again, your income. You can qualify for a fee waiver with USCIS. And again, you would have to prove that that your household is at, I think it's 150% poverty level or more. And then also maybe you have a qualifying financial hardship that has occurred that you would be able to prove to them. So later on, we'll answer questions. I know some of you might have very specific questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, but just for the sake of kind of the general resources, I will share as generally as I can. I know that many of you are maybe calling in from many parts of the US. And so I can answer more specific questions later. Yeah, well,
as you think, yeah, just thinking about your description, I think, you know, what fabulous advice to go through networks and to really start with that. And I wonder if you might describe some of the differences in the kind of, I mean, I think it's also important to distinguish, as you have, between getting the legal services at, you know, a reduced rate or for free on a pro bono basis, and then the separate question that we talked about earlier and that you just mentioned, which is, you know, the fees to pay to the U.S. government for many of these. So while it doesn't cost money to file an asylum application, most of the things that we've described today are expensive just in terms of paying because of the way that the U.S. government structures this. It's a sort of fee-based system, unfortunately. But when we turn to the legal services and the support of accredited representatives and entities within the community, are there differences that people might encounter in the availability of those supports based on the type of path that they would be pursuing? And I'm thinking in particular that people might find that there's more available resources for pursuing asylum than, for example, supporting an EB-2 or an EB-1 self-petition. And how might people think about that as they're evaluating these different pathways?
Yes, absolutely. I've seen in just my work that more of the community-based resources with more pro bono services tend to lean towards the asylum applications, just because typically that's a population that is not able to work and therefore would not be able to pay to begin with. If you're planning to pursue like EB-1 or something a little bit more specific, you may need to work with, you know, an attorney, and in that case, really lean into your networks of support or the people that you're connected with here, the organizations. It's kind of can be a matter of luck. You might find someone who's really willing to help. And, you know, there's no formula for that, unfortunately. It's kind of something that you're going to have to really learn how to advocate for yourself or find an advocate for you. But the best that you can do is just continue to be consistent and honest in this search. So I think with immigration, it can be quite complicated and very frustrating. But having a spirit of diligence is very helpful and important. And you made it this far, you know, so you've been able to prove that, you know, you can really, there's a reason why you're here. There's a reason why the university brought you or whichever institution brought you. And so just continuing to believe that, you know, there are going to be other people that are going to be willing to see you and see your talent and see the potential that you have for a life here. That being said, that is not guaranteed, unfortunately, but yeah, that's probably the best answer that I can give when it comes to just the difference of finding resources. Now, the great news is that places like Artistic Freedom Initiative exists. So, you know, that's a specific organization that saw a need where there was not a lot of support So there are like more specific organizations and institutions that are arising that specifically are there to help artists pursue these more specific legal routes that just a community-based resettlement agency may not have the capacity for. And so in that case, after this seminar, I'd be really glad to share a list of similar organizations, not only for artists, but other types of, sometimes it's more specific, sometimes there's like visual art. I came across one organization that works specifically to provide legal support for visual artists, things like that.
Great, thanks so much. It's really a lot of key considerations for people to keep in mind. And before we move on to sort of other kinds of supports that might be important and available in the community, are there any other advice or reflections that you would share just on the immigration sort of legal services or application process side of things?
Sure. Well, there's also some national directories that I can also share, like immigration law help, that specifically you can search like within your state for pro bono or low bono services. But let's see. Yeah, there's a lot to consider. I would imagine that if you're choosing between which pathway to pursue, you may want to speak with a few different people who have experience in this field if you can access that. So it's good to maybe not go for the first thing that you're told will work, but seek advice from others. That would be
that's really good advice, Catherine. And I remember Reza mentioning earlier that some of these different pathways can also be sequenced, that you can pursue, one visa route and then have, for example, asylum as a second option. And, that there is some ability to do that too. So it's a really good advice to try to be strategic, even though this is sometimes can feel like a very dire set of circumstances and feel very urgent. It's really tough. It's no right answer, but it is useful to get advice and think about that. The last, to me, key topic here to think about is the whole range of things that might complement people's needs as they're pursuing these pathways. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about other kinds of services that might be available to people in their community, depending on their particular needs, things that they might think about and also be able to seek help with.
Sure. So one place that you can go to in your locality, in your city, in your region is search for these immigrant social service agencies that exist there. Sometimes they are resettlement agencies. Sometimes they look like Catholic charities. Sometimes they look like they vary depending on where you live. But you want to find a social service that offers case management support. If you really feel like the institution that's hosting you doesn't have the capacity to help you think about, if you have kids, like, how am I going to ensure that my kids are, continue to get the support that they need at school? Like, I didn't grow up in this culture. I don't really understand all the stuff that's coming home from school. I need to talk to someone who can help me understand, what's going on here. Or if you're finding that you are having maybe some health issues and you need to seek support with navigating the healthcare system, which is very confusing for all of us, for those of us who were born here. So, or ensuring that you have the proper interpretation services for really important meetings that you may have. Typically, those offices that I mentioned earlier will have someone who can be like a case manager or someone who can support you as an advocate with these questions, depending on their capacity. But it's always good to just try and reach out. If you have a housing need, for example, hopefully that's not the case. But again, that's another option for you. Depending on what status you have, you may need tax support. There's a lot of free tax services that exist again, depending on where you live. I'm sorry to keep saying that, but this is such a broad population of people that, I know you're all calling in from everywhere. So again, I can follow up with you about more specifics of where you're living after the call, or I can send my email out. Occasionally, you may find that you may be strapped for money. If that's the case, that can be a little bit tricky in terms of requesting assistance, like government assistance. You most likely will not qualify if you're here on a temporary visa, but if you happen to have some sort of other status that would allow you to qualify for welfare benefits like subsidized childcare, food stamps, cash assistance, it's not recommended for many at this point in immigration, where immigration lies in the US, just because that can, Reza, you might be able to verify it for me, but I heard recently that in green card applications, they're now taking that into consideration.
You're talking about the public charge?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really strange because first of all, the question that they have added to the green card application for someone who's, let's say, filing the application on their own, it's so confusing. So the question actually reads, are you subject to the public charge rule, right? So the average person says that you can make like $1 million a year and say, hey, you know what, obviously not, but you are. Because what they mean that every category of a green card applicant is subject to the rule, except asylees and certain other, strange categories, right? And then they asking you about all these things about how much, how much your assets. So they say they have a formula, and the formula is, they're not supposed to discriminate based on age, but your age, your education, your work history, basically. So they look at the whole thing, even if you're not making enough money right now, they look at your potential, right? But even though they added this thing, I don't know what they're really doing with it, because they can do anything they want with it. You could go to your green card appointment. They could say, hey, you know what? We believe that you're inadmissible. You can't get a green card because you're going to be a public charge. And then, oh my God, if you happen to be a public charge and not having any money, how are you going to fight that? You can't even pay an attorney. So it's this. They added it, but I'm not sure about the logic of it, because at the same time, you still require, especially if you're going through the family-based, in most categories, to provide an affidavit of support from someone. And the whole idea of the affidavit of support was someone else was going to be, responsible for you. So it's just this confusing thing that right now, like everything else they do doesn't make sense. But yeah, they do ask about these things. And here's another interesting, and you mentioned it before, is that if you can't pay an application, you can apply for a fee waiver, right? How does that work? I mean, aren't you just admitting at that point that you're, subject to public charge if you can't afford to pay the, But we've had cases where they say, okay, if you can't afford it, apply for a fee waiver, but you may be getting a public charge. So it's
exactly
they
haven't figured out, like so many other things they haven't figured out.
exactly.
The important thing to emphasize here is that because a lot of these services can be thought through your a community-based immigration services organization, it's important to know that there are considerations about taking public benefits that are relevant to immigration, and so you should make sure that if you're getting these services or supports through a community organization, they should be able to help you identify whether there are any potential immigration consequences. But the good news is that even though some of the pathways that we've been talking about are not the most common routes pursued through these local service organizations, because the cases that we're talking about do present particular humanitarian needs, there are ways for you to get services and get benefits and supports from community organizations that might not traditionally work with scholars, artists, or writers at risk, but have the infrastructure in place to provide the kinds of supports that Catherine was describing, and that are available in your communities. And so they're real. We recognize that they're real needs, and there are things that you shouldn't necessarily feel that if you can't seek supports with them or get supports with them through your sponsor organization, that those are needs that can't be met within the communities, because often they can.
Exactly. Yes.
And on that, Catherine, I wonder if I can just go to you and Reza for just a final couple of words, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back for the exciting next installment of our panel. So, what if you any other thoughts on these issues before we take our break? Over to you first.
I think Catherine made a great point before. It's about the importance of your network in your community. Look, when I started doing this stuff, I literally did it out of my house. I had this house that had some extra bedrooms, and I had a friend from Iran who was a gallery owner, called up, said, "Hey, so-so's coming to the US. He's not going to be able to come back. Help him out." So he comes in. I give him a room in the house, and next thing you know, he needed help with his immigration stuff. So I did it. At that point, I did a barter. I said, "Look, you give me a painting, I'll do this." So we did a barter system. So, but then another artist and another artist. Next thing you know, so basically this whole AFI thing was started that way. So the reason I mentioned what Catherine said is important. A lot of private attorneys would love to find a way to work with artists. There are a lot of big law firms that they need some pro bono credits. So talking to organizations that are present today and then networks, they may be able to find a private attorney who would normally charge a arm and a leg to do an AB1 or an AB2 or to represent someone on an asylum application, who will be doing it, do it for free or find a way to do it, right? Yeah, knock on doors, talk to people, send out emails, make friends.
Exactly.
Thanks, Reza. Back over to you, Catherine.
Sure. I just had a few practical points to mention. Through all these processes, in case you don't already know, any official documents that you will need to use as evidence for your cases, if they're not in English, they'll need to be translated into English. So just consider that. You may want to find, kind of like what Reza was saying, people that that are fluent in those languages. Oftentimes you can ask them to do the translation, and then they would get that document notarized. Sometimes it's best to go through an actual translation agency, but again, that can cost you something. So just another cost factor to keep in mind, or at least another step that you'll need to take that you might not think about. And in addition, if you are here on a non-immigrant visa, like a J1 visa, if you happen to be interviewed for some type of media that will be published either online or in print, make sure that you do not mention anything about wanting to stay here long term. It's just another precaution to take so that doesn't come back to you later on in your immigration case. I know I've had to not deal with any issue, fortunately, but we've had to avoid that issue. And just another reminder, try your best not to compare your case with others. Everyone's coming from a different situation. Some people live in countries where there are different laws that support them more than maybe where you're coming from, or vice versa. So it can be very challenging, and there are a lot of resources out there too. I know of a really great resource that's called Inclusive Therapists. So this is if you're finding that it's kind of weighing on you mentally, emotionally. This organization, they operate out of Portland, but they exist to serve on a national level. They're a directory and community mental health resource that provides culturally affirming and responsive care. So culturally affirming care can be really hard to find in the US. And so they are an organization that's doing a really great job with that. So I'd be glad to share that information out after the workshop too.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And on that note of the importance of care, we'll take 5 minutes for self-care. Thanks everyone for listening through a long, complicated description of the Kafkaesque nature of the U.S. immigration system. Hope this has been useful, and I hope those watching the video also find it useful. We'll be sharing some resources, and those resources will be available on the Onwards website. And with that, I'm going to we'll temporarily adjourn. We'll be back in 5 minutes and continue with the next phase, which is going to be a very exciting description of people's personal experience with this. So the been there, done that phase of the event will be coming up next with our moderator, Mike Hoy. Thanks.